Joining us from Washington, political analyst and lawyer Ginger Chapman. A very warm welcome to the program, Ms. Ginger. Let's start with the big picture. Why do you think the current debate on security guarantees is so disconnected from Ukraine's actual needs?
Well, thank you, Rana, for having me today, and greetings to your viewers. And what we are seeing, the differences between the Russian side and the Ukrainian NATO side appear to be irreconcilable. The two sides are so far apart, and there seems to be almost no hope of reconciling the two positions. As much as President Trump is attempting to, it appears that Trump is finally waking up to the reality that on one hand, Russia does not need to make peace. What they need is a correction. Russia does not need a ceasefire. Russia needs a long-term peace solution, and they are willing to push forward on the battlefield until they accomplish that. On the other hand, Ukraine and NATO are locked into a position where they are refusing to negotiate, and they are essentially going down this path that they've been on, thinking that somehow the United States will be able to pull off a miracle and restore all of the territory that Kiev has lost in this war.
Why doesn't the NATO want to negotiate, Ms. Chapman?
As well, first of all,
and what miracle do they await from President Donald Trump or from the United States at this point?
Well, NATO is trapped. They are in a position where their leaders are losing power in their own country. For example, France and Germany are on the edge of bankruptcy. England, Britain, they are going through social unrest. Neither of these NATO countries can actually field a military force that they plan to field in response to Russia. And indeed, they actually expect that the United States will somehow send in boots on the ground, perhaps from Ramstein in Germany, perhaps from Romania or Moldova. But this is becoming untenable. And as we saw after Alaska, this was the first time President Trump had an opportunity to hear President Putin's side. And Trump came out of Alaska saying he agrees with Putin. No ceasefire and no NATO membership for Ukraine. This created a flurry of panic and desperation amongst our NATO partners. And indeed, what they want is they want a ceasefire. They want a freezing of the conflict lines, much what we saw in North Korea.
Ms. Chapman, sorry to interrupt you, but on a positive note, you said at the beginning of your answer that U.S. President Donald Trump is seeking a ceasefire.
Yes, well, actually, it appears that Trump has abandoned the Kiev, Zelensky, the Ukraine demands for a ceasefire because this would only freeze the conflict. And for NATO, a ceasefire means they will send in more troops and more weapons along the front lines of Ukraine to prepare for further conflict with Russia. So for NATO, they view the ceasefire as a way to get more of their combatants onto the field. For Russia, the ceasefire is not an end, not a long-term peaceful end to the conflict. And Trump is caught in the middle. Trump is starting to wake up to the reality that he cannot reconcile NATO and Russia. So he is trying to extricate the United States by saying, we have nothing to do with this. This is not our war. If NATO and the EU want to continue the war, we will send them the weapons. However, this is another delusion, however, on the part of Trump, because we cannot simultaneously say we are brokering an end to the war and we are brokering and negotiating peace at the same time we are sending weapons. And at the same time, this is America's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So the reason Trump is failing, he is trying to wear two hats. He is slowly waking up. And what we are seeing is essentially this conflict will be resolved on the battlefield because Trump has no cards against Russia. We have no leverage against Russia. And our only leverage against Ukraine and NATO is the threat to pull out. We see that Donald Trump cannot pull out. Something about his
So,
personality.
Ms. Champion, now you read that this battle will be resolved?
Correct. This battle will play out on the battlefield in one of two ways. Either the Ukrainian army will collapse or the Russian army will achieve dominance. Both of those have the same effect, and this is inevitable. And in the bigger picture, what we have seen is President Joe Biden using this war. He wound up driving Russia into the arms of China and weakened America's position. And President Trump has, against his campaign promises, Trump has followed Biden's same policies of arming Ukraine. And the end result of this is we have locked the United States onto the losing side of this battle. And indeed, by expanding and escalating the battle, Trump is just driving other of our allies into the arms of China. For example,
about his campaign promises, we will never forget when he made a statement announcing that he will end this war in 24 hours if he was the president.
Yes, and Trump has realized that he is up against forces he underestimated when he was a candidate. He has found himself bogged
Did he
down.
actually underestimate, or was it just the campaign promises, Ms. Champman?
Trump has overestimated his own negotiating abilities. He underestimated the political forces that Joe Biden and NATO have left behind. But essentially, Trump approached this as though he was approaching a trade union negotiation in New York City over construction of a building. This is not the same at all. Dealing with countries, especially with superpowers on an international stage, it appears to be something Trump was simply not prepared for. And indeed, we saw his cabinet picks. Much like in his first term, he picked personnel that were unqualified for the duties he wanted them to carry out. A great example, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a neocon war hawk who wanted to continue the hostilities with Russia. We saw General Keith Kellogg, who basically advocated on the side of Ukraine instead of advocating for Trump's position. So we've seen many people in Trump's cabinet actively working against him, and his goal of ending the war in 24 hours, then it was ending the war in 100 days, then 6 months, and now we are more bogged into the war than ever. Trump appears unable to carry out his policies in the face of resistance from his own cabinet, from senators in Congress, such as Lindsey Graham, and indeed from NATO and the EU. However, what we are seeing is because of facts on the ground, because Russia is winning this war, and other factors, for example, Ukraine's minerals that the United States signed contracts for. All of Ukraine's resources are now on the Russian side of the front lines. So this is a losing proposition. The reality is Trump will not be able to negotiate peace on the path he is on because he is negotiating peace from the position of a co-belligerent, and he is
Okay,
unable to bring.
Ms. Chapman, if the West wants to reassure Ukraine credibly, what concrete steps, military, financially, or sanctions related, would actually shift Putin's calculus?
One thing we have seen is that sanctions are a failure. The United States is not as powerful as we were 20, 30 years ago. And indeed, the more we sanction, the more we drive other countries to develop paths and institutions to get around our sanctions. And indeed, what Trump could do to make peace is probably the last thing his personality is capable of doing. We need to get the interested parties, the countries that are the countries that have the greatest interest. For example, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Moldova, Monrovia. These are the countries that are Ukraine's neighbors. They have the greatest interest. And these are the countries that Trump should say, you need to negotiate terms with Russia. We need to get the EU and Western countries and NATO out of the negotiations because their goals are to continue the war. And indeed, they cannot even agree on what a definition of a security guarantee is.
Why doesn't Trump ask the countries you mentioned, Ms. Chapman, to intervene to solve this catastrophe?
First, that would be too practical, and that would remove Trump from the center of attention. We, America, we need to retreat and bow out and leave this to the countries with the greatest interest, the most to lose, the most to gain from their relationships with Russia. And Trump wants to be right in the center, use the force of his personality to be the peacemaker, to attain his Nobel Peace Prize. But indeed, America is now the greatest obstacle to peace. A few weeks ago, we were saying Kiev and Zelensky were the greatest obstacle to peace, but now it is our continued flow of weapons, even through NATO, that is hindering peace, and our refusal to let the countries that have the most to lose and gain. Once again, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, they all have interests in Ukraine. These are the countries that will be able to find a peace process. And indeed, Ukraine may likely wind up as a rump state. They may lose that Transnistria, Transcarpathia to Hungary. Russia is, as we speak, they are operating on the southern border of Ukraine. They are getting closer to Odessa, and they will take the Black Sea. This is theirs historically this is their region historically.
So we conclude your segment, Ms. Ginger Chapman, with your words that the United States and Donald Trump is the main, of course, aggressor in this war, and is the main partner that doesn't want peace to take place or is making peace difficult. Thank you, Ginger Chapman, for your insights. What I said is right?
Correct. Right now, America is
the obstacle.